Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another special edition House Call video chat episode as part of our ACC coverage here on HCP Live. I'm Kevin Townsend, Managing Editor of HCP Live, and I'm joined today by Dr. Muthu Vadaganathan, a cardiologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Muthu and I were actually planning to talk in Chicago sometime next week regarding some of the new SGLT-2 inhibitor data that was coming out as part of the advances in cardiometabolic health that seem to almost always highlight the ACC meetings. But obviously that's not happening anymore. So Muthu is joining me virtually this morning, and we're going to have that talk anyway. So how you doing, Doc?
Yeah, I'm doing just great, as well as I could be. So thank you for having me, especially in this alternative format. And hopefully we can remotely highlight some of the recent work and future trajectories of this space for the broader audience.
Absolutely. It's, I think, given the circumstances, this is not what everyone wants to be doing, but, optimistically speaking, this is something that if we lay the groundwork for doing well enough this year, it gives us capability in the years to come to sort of perfect it in case anything happens. So glad we can have the talk anyway. So let's just dive into it. Obviously, we have a very competitive agent class in SGLT-2 inhibitors. Obviously, a lot of new data that was planned for discussion at ACC. Can you share a little bit of what you think was going to highlight or still highlights, the agenda of discussion there?
So just a quick background for the audience about where we were and how we got where we are with this therapeutic class. There are 4 FDA-approved SGLT-2 inhibitors in the United States, and they were first introduced in March of 2013, and they were approved for use in patients with type 2 diabetes for their glucose-lowering potential. However, over the subsequent years, it was learned that in large randomized clinical trials that these therapies have broader benefits, including protection against cardiovascular events and important renal events. And so now they're undergoing dedicated study among patients with established heart failure as well as established chronic kidney disease, both with and without diabetes. The first of those dedicated trials have been reported in both heart failure and chronic kidney disease last year, the DAPA heart failure study in heart failure and the Credence study in chronic kidney disease. And in 2020, we anticipate new studies being reported as early as the summer, if there are no anticipated delays given COVID-19, about whether these benefits seen in heart failure and chronic kidney disease extend to the broader class.
I remember that being probably one of the biggest discussion points that we had at AHA this year is seeing the evolution to discussion. CKD and its benefits for that. Obviously, patients have a ton of overlap there. So is there anything particular in the data that stands out to you as the most impressive endpoints that we've reached so far within these particular individual drugs?
Absolutely. So the striking benefit was related to heart failure, and it came at somewhat of a surprise. This was an endpoint that wasn't mandated to be studied by the US FDA in the dedicated safety trials, but was the endpoint that was perhaps most consistent in each of the regulatory programs in the first years after initial drug release. And certainly those benefits were confirmed in a large and really landmark and practice-changing study called DAPA heart failure that was presented late last year, and which studied the role of dapagliflozin in patients with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, and showed that the benefits on cardiovascular death or heart failure hospitalization and urgent heart failure events extended not only to patients with diabetes, which we somewhat expected, but fascinatingly to patients without diabetes. And I think that was an eye-opener and suggested that these therapies have broader cardiometabolic effects, not confined alone to type 2 diabetes, and really laid the foundation for their study in multiple disease states. And I do anticipate that these drugs are going to have a critical role in both the prevention and treatment of heart failure.
That's really fascinating. And my first follow-up question with that is, what exactly does that patient population look like that could stand to benefit from its overall cardiometabolic benefits and also heart failure risk reduction? I mean, how well aligned are those two, and or I guess how well overlapped are those two?
It's another great question. Everything we've learned is that higher risk patients certainly benefit more from an absolute perspective. They perhaps have more to gain. But the world of type 2 diabetes is quite broad. There are 30 million patients in the United States estimated to have type 2 diabetes, of which about 7 million have established cardiovascular disease. Those patients certainly are our highest risk patients, and that's really where the data has shown clear benefits and impressive risk reductions. In lower risk populations without known at least atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, those patients still do benefit, especially with respect to heart failure risk reduction and renal protection. But the anticipated range of risk benefits may be lower just as a result that they're a lower risk population. In terms of the heart failure population, I think we're learning more. DAPA heart failure was the first dedicated study of those patients. And the main thing we're trying to sort out as a community is how to best place the SGLT-2 inhibitors in the background of the number of other drugs we have already established over the last 30 to 35 years of heart failure clinical trial history. And the DAPA heart failure study, and one of the main studies I was very interested to learn about from ACC 2020, was a sub-study of DAPA heart failure that was examining the effects of dapagliflozin versus placebo on the background of varying background medical therapy. How do patients do on perhaps on and off sacubitril valsartan, on and off a mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist? Those are important questions facing clinicians in terms of timing of initiation and how to best sequence these therapies in practice.
What about, I guess, the range of dosing and frequency of dosing? Something else that comes to mind is empagliflozin. I think recently was approved for oral use as well as an add-on, sort of just kind of like you said, like complement its role as an add-on therapy for risk reduction. What sort of emphasis is being put on that, I guess, in terms of convenience for patients?
You raise an important question about practical use and the breadth of the labeling. I mentioned starting in 2013, all 4 SGLT2 inhibitors are approved for their use in diabetes for their glucose lowering potential. In addition, 3 of the SGLT2 inhibitors, the ones that have been reported and studied to date, have additional cardiovascular specific labels. Empagliflozin has a label for use to reduce cardiovascular death. Canagliflozin has a specific label to lower the rates of major adverse cardiovascular events. And dapagliflozin has a label specific to lowering the risk of hospitalization for heart failure. In addition, based on the Credence trial, canagliflozin is indicated and approved to reduce heart failure events and renal progression events in patients with diabetic kidney disease. Now, in terms of the dosing, it's become quite simpler. All 4 therapies are once daily medications taken in the morning, while there have been 2 doses for several of the therapies for use in diabetes. And while the higher doses seem to have perhaps better metabolic effects or better glucose lowering effects, their efficacy profile with respect to cardiovascular events does not appear to differ based on the low or high dose when studied in patients with type 2 diabetes. Now, in heart failure, what is being studied are fixed doses, um, both for dapagliflozin and empagliflozin. These are the largest heart failure programs to date that are underway or recently reported. Those are all studying fixed doses of milligrams once daily taken in the morning of these therapies. And so I think that, Kevin, you raise a really important point that these therapies stand unique from the rest of the heart failure armamentarium in that they are fixed doses that don't need dose titration. They do not need really rigorous follow-up. Perhaps monitoring renal function is an important aspect, but otherwise, they're very easy to apply and practically implement in practice.